Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I am really excited to be joined by Dr. Timothy O'Connor, a professor of philosophy at Indiana University. Hey there, Dr. O'Connor.
Hey there, Jordan.
Thank you for coming on. We're going to be discussing his paper on the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. And I'm doing this because Easter's coming up, and typically we think about Jesus's resurrection, which is very important, foundational to this. But we don't want to neglect that we Christians will be raised in the resurrection at the end of the age, and we want to think about what that will be like. So thank you again, and let's go ahead and jump in here. What is the doctrine of the resurrection of the body?
All right, great. As you say, it's a very fitting topic in this Easter season. So we Christians believe that God raised Jesus from the grave, his body in some manner glorified. In his first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 15, the Apostle Paul tells us that the risen Christ, he says, is the first fruits, and we shall all follow him in a general resurrection when God inaugurates a new creation. So this chapter in Paul's epistle is probably the most detailed discussion of the general resurrection that we have in the New Testament. But even there, it doesn't spell things out very much. Paul just gives us some suggestive metaphors rather than a metaphysical treatise. Paul was a theologian, not a philosopher. Many Christians think of the general resurrection of the dead this way. So they say, okay, I die, meaning my body ceases to function, permanent loss of heart or brain function, according to current medical definitions. But there is more to me, they think, than my body. Indeed, this further thing is the only truly essential part of me. It's what they call my soul, understood to be a simple, non-material substance or thing that is the seat, you might say, of my consciousness and my powers, my psychological powers to think and to decide. That's just what a soul is on this view. It's known, this kind of view is known to philosophers as substance dualism, because according to it, people, as we know them, have two distinct substance parts, their body and their soul. And the unity of the person consists in the constant causal interaction between the body and the soul via the brain, right? That's the point of contact. And while it might be that in this life, the proper functioning of my soul depends on my having an intact body, and more specifically, of course, an intact and functioning brain and nervous system. At death, the idea is God simply sustains the soul directly in existence when the body dies and later decays. And then we typical extension of this view says that we then continue to exist as naked souls until God brings an end to this age and, among other things, gives us entirely new, glorified, and permanent bodies. So the first thing I would say about this very common way of thinking about the human person and common Christian way of thinking about the general resurrection is that while I'm not inclined to accept it, I don't claim to be sure about the metaphysics of persons, but I don't think that it is demonstrably inconsistent with anything in the Bible. As with Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians, so much elsewhere in the Bible. The various texts of the Bible are simply not written in the language of metaphysics any more than they are written in the language of science. That's not, of course, to say that they don't ever have metaphysical implications. Declaring the existence of the Almighty God, maker of heaven and earth, is laying down a pretty big metaphysical marker, right? So yeah, there are metaphysical implications, but you might say the speculative, theoretical question of how exactly we should think of the details, say, of God's very being, tends not to be addressed, or God's relationship to time, or of the communion of saints, or the nature of the soul. I wanted to say, because there's often a lot of confusion on this point, and some people think, well, look, the Bible talks about the soul, and who are you to deny the existence of the soul? I affirm the soul. I believe that we are ensouled. I like to think of it more adjectively than as a noun. But I affirm the soul in the functional sense that the biblical writers speak of it, I believe. Substance dualism, which I just kind of sketched very quickly, is one metaphysical theory about the nature of the soul. And I regard it as an unfortunate linguistic fact that the functional term, the biblical functional term soul, has come to just be just reduced to the entity postulated by just one theory of metaphysical theory of the soul. So, all right, here's a start on a different theory of the soul, one that I'm more, as I said, more inclined to. We can get into the details later. But it starts by saying that we are entirely composed of material parts. In that sense, we are bodily beings, organized bodies, organized in the form of living human bodies. But it rejects the notion that we are nothing but atoms in motion. Many people think this view just entails that. But that's just not true. To say that we are materially composed, you might call it substance monism about persons. God's an immaterial substance, but about persons, a kind of substance monism, does not entail reductionism, the kind of nothing buttery language that you sometimes hear from the likes of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and people like that. I'm sure we're going to want to say more about that, what this anti-reductionist business is. But I'll stop right there in order to note one key commitment that the monist seems to have when it comes to the general resurrection. Okay, since that's what you asked about. So since we are living bodies, and bodies, of course, are continuously changing their parts very rapidly, then the natural way to think about what makes this body the same body as the body my 10-year-old self had, is that there's been an internally driven material causal continuity of life-sustaining processes, homeostatic, processes, metabolism, and all that, from then until now. One unbroken, largely internally driven process. Not entirely, of course. I have to take in all kinds of things. But it's a life is a dynamic, internally driven, largely internally driven process. And so to say that it's the same body, even though it's very different in size, completely different parts, is just to say that it is the current stage of an unbroken, continuous process. All right, but if that's what I am metaphysically, then for me to eventually rise from the dead, it seems that there would have to be a significant continuity of this sort between me at the time of my death and me at the time of the general resurrection, which is presumably going to be a long, long ways after the time of my death.
In other words, there can't be a gap in your, I'm going to say existence, and you mean this kind of causal continuity.
Yeah, the process of life has to, it seems like, is vital in some sense. I mean, yeah, again, we'll think about the details and about, what ways we might spin the basic view. But, the problem, of course, is that process comes to an abrupt crashing halt at death. Not only that, but the body doesn't, persist dead in a kind of suspended animation. it decays, it completely breaks down. Parts of my body enter the biosphere, right? So given that, at first glance, the resurrection of me, the very individual, and not some duplicate. Easily, God could easily create a duplicate of me at some later time that has, including a psychological duplicate, who has a bunch of false memories. He thinks he lived, during such and such period and all that. But that would be a mere duplicate of me. The hope of the resurrection is not that somebody a lot like me gets to live and enjoy the presence of God,
Right.
in a kind of full-on sense. No, it's that I, the very individual, do. And so it can easily seem impossible, given the facts of life and death as we know. But I'll just make one observation. So there's a real challenge here, and I expect we're going to want to talk about that. But I just want to make one observation before I turn things back over to you, which is this. In that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that I referred to, the Apostle Paul talks about the resurrection using a metaphor. He says, my earthly body is a seed. He says he likens it to a seed that is sown, that is buried, I take it, right? A seed that is sown and at God's appointed time is raised as an imperishable, glorified, empowered, spiritual body. Everyone puzzles over that term, spiritual. So the Apostle Paul seems to be signaling a kind of at least minimal material continuity between the two bodies. There is such a continuity between an actual seed, a literal seed, and the plant, right, that grows up, rather than just a wholesale replacement. The one becomes the other, only in this case through a supernatural rather than natural process that we're not told much of anything about.
Now, this is my understanding, tell me if I'm correct about this. You build your model of the resurrection of the body off of Dean Zimmerman's falling elevator model.
That's right.
It draws upon it. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it would be helpful to first explain what Zimmerman's falling elevator model is before we go any further.
Okay. So the term falling elevator model that Dean uses takes its inspiration from old Looney Tunes cartoons where you'd have a character in an elevator that because of some dastardly machination, is now, it breaks away and it's hurtling down the shaft towards, destruction and certain death of the character inside. And just before the crash hits with a loud, explosion, the character hops out of the elevator and survives death, right? Okay. Kids, don't try that at home. It might not work out quite that way.
I think the Mythbusters might have tested this and it didn't work.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's what happens in cartoons. So then Zimmerman invites us to imagine then that just as we are about to die, all the basic elements that constitute our body at that moment of death fission. They give rise through an internal process of two identical products and rather than one. But they do so in a weirdly coordinated way so that one product of the fission is the corpse, located just where the living body was at the moment of fission. The other product is a body that is spatially disconnected from the scene, right? Somewhere known only to God. God, of course, has to do something special to keep that body alive since it was, after all, just about to die, right? That's easy enough if death was about to happen because you were right in front of a runaway train or you're in that falling elevator, right? Because now you're no longer, as long as he doesn't put you into that context, you're safe. But where death was just about to happen because your body is falling apart, right, in a process of multiple failures of organs, more tinkering is going to be needed in order to make sure we don't just have two corpses here,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't going to help, right?
Right.
But that's not impossible, right? Surely for the divine physician to heal you of your infirmities at the very moment when he does that. All right, so we start with that picture. We have two fission products of my pre-mortem, pre-death body, but notice only one of them is materially, causally continuous with it, in the sense that only one of them is a new stage of an unbroken set of processes that collectively constitute an ongoing life of a body, right? And that is the body that my children don't see when they're all gathered at my bedside at that moment, right? What they see when I flatline, forgive me, I have Irish ancestry, so we tend to speak bluntly about such things. And philosophers are notorious for doing this sort of thing. This can be a painful topic for some. So let me acknowledge that. Turn this off. Come to a better time if I talk about this too crassly. Okay, so when I die, what my children see, or what anyone around me at that time sees, is a husk, though an unusual husk. It's a full, thick, three-dimensional husk through and through, but it's still a husk. It's something. It's now non-living tissue that my body, you might say, sloughs off in the fission process, while I, continue on elsewhere, known only to God. I jump off. I jump out of the elevator just in the nick of time. So that's the falling elevator model. That's a way for the materialist that Zimmerman proposes to think about death, even though Zimmerman himself is not a materialist. And by the way, we'll eventually have to talk about that term materialism. Because I don't call myself a materialist, but I do think we're materially composed.
Yes. I think that will come out,
Yeah.
especially when we start talking about your particular, like the way you tweak this story about the falling elevator. But okay, so my kind of way of summarizing that is right before death, like this split second before death, every cell fissions, every cell splits. So you get this complete copy. Essentially, you got these two, but you're not just that body. You're more than that. And you only go with one of those,
right?
One of those bodies, and then what's left, the other one is just this corpse.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yeah, you are the living continuation of the original body, pre-fission.
Yes.
The corpse is not a living continuation of the body prior to the fission. So it's not, right? So it's not that living thing.
Yeah. Okay. So that is so just to complete the story, the way that this is the story about the resurrection is your existence, you continue on. Now, let me ask about this. So people that die like today, the resurrection hasn't happened yet. So this is going to be like today, if someone dies and there's this fission, right, split second before, they continue on. So are they experiencing resurrection like right now on this model?
Good. This is I think of the model as being neutral on this question. That is, I think we should allow for two variations on it. And here you might, and there's a reason why we might want to think about both variations. Well, start with a theological worry with this picture, right? The picture is, look, the Apostle Paul speaks of the resurrection of the dead as this climactic event. It's this thing we hope for, right? We look to the resurrection of the dead. We long for that, right? And then the objection is, but wait, Tim, you say, I just keep right on going, having a body, right? And then, well, maybe God kind of does gussies up my body in some interesting kind of way. But it seems kind of anticlimactic. Why are the creeds all talking about the resurrection of the dead, right? As this object of Christian hope, right? When you don't think we ever cease being embodied. So that's kind of worry, right, that one might have. Now, you can mitigate that worry one way. So here's one variant on the model, is to say, well, maybe we get a kind of clunker body at first. That is initially, right? That's the fission product is, I mean, it's still a body subject to decay. God has to sustain it alive. And maybe, it's a no frills kind of body, right? As you probably, as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, there's some debates among Christian theologians about what to think exactly about the period between an individual's death and the general resurrection. Do they exist, right? Or is there something called soul sleep, right? Right. And this is related to this kind of consideration. So you might say, so one version is to say, yeah, you continue existing, right? But what we're looking forward to is, Jesus had an ordinary human body when he was on earth, but he was resurrected with a glorified body, right? Which, again, we're not told a lot about it, but we do know that when some of his immediate followers saw him post-resurrection, they didn't recognize him at first. So it looked dramatically different, and no doubt it functioned in certain interestingly different ways. So that's what we're looking forward to. Like Paul says, we were sown perishable, but we will be raised imperishable. There's something dramatically different. Okay, so maybe you say that's enough for it to be something to even put in the creeds. A lot of theological content doesn't get into the creeds, but the resurrection of the dead does. Maybe that's why it's there. It's such a dramatic transformation of the body. That raises questions all by itself. But let me pause. Variant 2. Variant 2 says, well, if fissions can happen across spatial gaps, if it's possible for something to have the power to persist across a gap of space. It's kind of weird to think of a body doing that. Bodies usually just move in continuous spatial paths. Well, if that's possible, then why not perhaps a temporal gap as well? So then the thought is the act of fissioning begins at the moment of your death, but it doesn't fully, one half of it, the materialization of one half of it doesn't happen for a long stretch of time later. And it's all synchronized. We're all in sync in terms of that alternate product. You could say that. And then the resurrection is a big deal because that's where you pick back up again, right? And then the thought is, so there's a temporal gap, right, between you just at the moment of fission and you at the general resurrection, right? But there's not a cessation, right, of a process. It's just the process. It's just this stretched out causal action of continuation that is, it's gappy, it's jumpy rather than being continuous. Very strange. If that's possible, then that would be one way to go. Now, if you do go that way, you're going to have to embrace the view of those who read the New Testament as thinking that we don't, we're not conscious beings prior to the resurrection. There's a lot of different texts. You could get into a range of texts here, but it's because on this view, you are essentially embodied. That's what you are. You are a body of a certain kind. And so if that in that period where that body is not yet continuing on, you are not there either. You're in this kind of weird limbo status. Do you cease to be, but you're certainly not a conscious per individual. So that would be a reason not to go that way. You can make the resurrection seem like the big deal that Paul seems to think it is. It seems more natural to go that route, but then you're forced to embrace this consequence that don't you don't consciously persist until the time of the resurrection.
Because there's this space in time
Yeah.
where this gap in time where you're not around.
Yeah,
Like you're
right.
not, your body's not there.
That's right.
So then you, okay, I see. Yeah, I guess the way I was thinking of it was maybe like from the perspective of the person that's continuing on. Trenton Merrick's gave this analogy, and I thought this is helpful for like getting the idea. He gave this analogy of a time machine. So he's like, say that I get in a time machine and I go to the future, like maybe 1,000 years from now. Well, for everybody else, it looks like Jordan existed, but then now Jordan doesn't exist. Like he's gone for 1,000 years. He's nowhere to be found. He no longer exists. But then you find me existing again 1,000 years later. So it looks like Jordan wasn't conscious for 1,000 years, but experientially, like I never stopped being conscious. I just
That's right.
jumped.
That's right. That's right. It would seem that way to you. You're right. And so when people say, well, wait a minute, Jesus said to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. The thought is, well, it will seem that way to that individual. The very next moment of his waking self, he is. And after all, if you're going to use that text, someone wants to use that text as a proof text, they have the problem that Jesus himself was not in paradise immediately, right, on Good Friday after his death, right? It's Easter Sunday. So something, funny is going on with that language already. We already know that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that helps me get a sense of some varieties of this model, ways that you could still speak of. I guess what I was thinking was the way the New Testament speaks of it. It's like this thing in the future. It's not happening like today. So if you die today, this isn't going to happen to you today. It seems like it's distant in the future. But then if you go that direction and say, well, it's like a temporal gap, then that's one way. And you also gave that other version, which is like, well, maybe it's just speaking like it's just a dramatic change. And that's what it's really getting at. It can happen now. It's very dramatic. Okay, let's continue on. So that's the falling elevator model. But there's this major objection that has been raised against it. What's this major objection?
Okay. So it's a little bit complicated, but I think people should be able to follow it. So the objection starts off this way. It says, okay, if it's possible for God to enable all the parts of my body simultaneously to fission at the moment of my death, then it's at least possible for God to do this, to allow this to occur when I'm not about to die. Right? It's at least possible. Philosophers like thought experiments, right? So now follow out this thought experiment. If God did that, suppose he did that. Right now, presumably neither of us are about to die. Suppose he causes a fission to occur such that there is a body identical to the body, visually identical to the body that you have or that I have somewhere else, as well as right here now continuing to talk. Now we would have two equally good candidates for being me. That is, the original pre-fission embodied person. So we have two candidates, not just one, as with the death scenario where one of the products is a mere corpse. And these two bodies have lives that are both equally continuous with the original. Now, they cannot, as a matter of logic, both be identical to the original me because they are not identical to each other. And as logicians like to say, identity is transitive. If A is identical to B, and A and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. Or if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, Well, then B and C have to be identical. That is, if we're talking identity here, these are just three different names, A, B, and C, placeholders for just one thing. But we know B and C are different. They're two different bodies. They're in different places. They're now saying different things, responding differently to their different environments. So they can't both be me. That just doesn't make sense. And it seems like it would be arbitrary to pick one of them and say, oh, that's you. The other is just a weird product that you kind of gave rise to. The new thing that's not identical to you, it's just a duplicate of you, right? It seems arbitrary to say it alone is me and not the other one. So it seems like we can't say of either one of them that it's identical to you. And if they can't both be, well, then the only alternative is neither of them is, right? So that is, I don't survive this kind of fission event when there are two fission products that are equally alive and in other respects, just like the original. So the objector points this out. He says, things would be weirder if it happened this way, but that should be possible if the original scenario is possible. Now the objector continues. Whether or not something at one time is really truly the continuation of something at an earlier time should be entirely determined by the internal relationship between them, right? In the case where that needed internal relationship between them is the relation of life, being this sharing the same life, well, then the idea is if it obtains between two stages, same life, they should just be the same things then, period. It shouldn't matter what relationship these things at different times have to other things at the same time, right? I'm the same person on this view as my 10-year-old self. Well, my 10-year-old self was talking to my now deceased mother. I'm not talking to my now deceased mother. It had all kinds of relationships to other things, but it doesn't bear on whether or not it's identical to me. It's this right? Haven't we been talking about? It's this internal material causal process. But now the falling elevator. So here's the objector now brings the conclusion to a head. The falling elevator model account of resurrection assumes that these other relations do matter. It's forced to say, well, I survive if and only if there is exactly one best candidate for being identical to the earlier me, right? If there's more than one equally good candidate, I perish. I don't survive the fission. But think about it, says the objector, from the point of view of the supposedly surviving person on the elevator model, where there's just a corpse and then the surviving person. So this person thinks first, whew, right? That was close. I'm alive. Thanks be to God. But then, if he's a philosopher, his second thought is, wait a minute. I'm sure glad that God didn't allow my body to fission into three parts, with two of them living. If he had done that, I would have died. But that seems like a really strange thing for this thing to think, since he would have been intrinsically the same and born exactly the same continuity of life relationship with the original, even if there had been this other thing going on. That's just external to my relationship to the original. As one philosophy writer puts it, death by competition is surely the strangest form of death, right? So there's something wrong going on here. Is the objection is basically saying the view has an absurd consequence, that whether or not I am identical to a prior stage of an ongoing living life depends in part on what else is happening around it. And that seems like a problem. But notice, it's not so much, or it's not in the first instance an objection to the falling elevator model, it's really an objection to the idea of sameness of body, right? It's because we can think about fission scenarios without the resurrection and all that, right? And we could imagine some kind of earthly process whereby scientists can somehow prompt cells to bud off in weird kinds of ways, and the objection seems to be saying there's something funny about continuity of life as a criterion of continued identity. It has this weird implication that it's not enough. It has to be, so basically the criterion has to be continuity of life plus no competition. And that seems like a kind of ad hoc rider that you have to tack on in order to handle this kind of weird scenario. It doesn't look like a good candidate for a fundamental metaphysical principle about whether two things are or are not identical. That's like I said, it's a bit complicated, but that's the objection.
You still model your version of the resurrection of the body off of the falling elevator model, but you do it in such a way that you avoid this worry, this objection. So you do this by appealing to emergent individuals. So can you explain what is the emergent individuals account of human persons?
Yeah, so this takes us back to why I said earlier I don't like the term materialism to describe the view I have. Van Inwagen, who is, there's a kind of dialectic between Zimmerman, the dualist, and Van Inwagen, who is happy to call himself a materialist about the human person. What's the difference? Why don't I agree with Van Inwagen that we are living animals of a certain kind, human, distinctively human creatures, and yet there are some differences. So my agreement with Van Inwagen is that I think that there are good empirical reasons for thinking that all of our parts are material. There's not some further self-contained immaterial part of us that does the thinking, that interacts with the brain. But I agree, unlike Van Inwagen, I agree with substance dualists that there are also good reasons for thinking that our capacities for conscious awareness, for reflective knowledge and understanding, and for deliberate voluntary choice, all these capacities transcend neural function of the brain. They are strongly, as I and other philosophers might put it, they are strongly emergent capacities. They're causally sustained, undoubtedly, by neural functions. Which neural functions exactly, we don't yet know. Neuroscience is really still in its infancy. But our ever-changing states of conscious awareness, of understanding, and the intermittent choices are that are the outworkings of those capacities. These are all something over and above the neural states with which they co-evolve. Philosophical lingo sometimes gets used in different ways here, but you can call this broad sort of view a property dualism, kind of substance monism, but property dualism. It's kind of in between the standard issue materialism and substance dualism. Now, an interesting consequence of believing, as I do, that there are such emergent properties, properties you might say that are irreducibly of the whole, right? They don't reduce to the properties and relations of the parts. They're gestalt, holistic properties of the whole living person, is that these kinds of properties unite the bodies that undergo them in a way that's not true of typical complex objects. So rocks, buildings, non-conscious living systems, perhaps such as trees, and sophisticated information processing machines, such as computers, right? None of them, at least on my view, I don't think we have any empirical reason to think they have these gestalt or holistic or emergent properties of the whole that impart influence the way the structured system behaves. So for those kinds of things, it really is true, right, that the features and behavior of the whole are completely determined by the features and relationships among the ultimate parts of those things for non-emergent material objects. Okay, so it would seem like, so when you think about this, you'd say that when God contemplates a garden variety part of the unfolding cosmos, my computer say, then it's enough for him to be aware of all the computer's subatomic parts and their internal and external particle interactions, right? That's all God needs to do. The large-scale computer patterns are not really something extra in the final analysis, right? You might say, if counting up all the, think about it this way, if suppose you had a super intelligence that had a super penetrating intelligence, God created an angelic intelligence that could just discern right down to the subatomic level in some sense, if that made sense, which it doesn't really, but just go with the thought experiment, right? Yeah. And so could just see reality in its utterly granulate detail, right? And has no computational limits. So can quickly discern the quantum mechanical, patterns, right? The laws of the subatomic realm, how these things co-evolve together, right? For a being like that, if it were to count up all the objects in reality and it ignored rocks and buildings and computers and trees, it seems wrong to say that he missed those things. You might say he implicitly captured them by capturing all of their parts. They're not really something over and above all of those things, right? They're not, you might say, full-fledged members of the basic, inventory of reality. God's inventory of reality. They kind of just show up. Once you mention all the parts, you kind of implicitly refer to them. They're kind of like groups of things, right? Yeah. Groups of individuals. You don't have to count the group over and above all the individual people in a group to count all the things there are. Groups aren't something over and above. Seems like that. For non-emergent objects, it's the only reason it doesn't seem that way to us is we can't track things at a microphysical level. So for us, these kind of macroscopic categories, rocks and so on, are really significant. We can't do away with these categories and be able to talk about the world. But that just seems to be an artifact of our limitations, our perceptual limitations, our cognitive, our computational limitations, whatever, even our interests, right? The way we carve things up. We don't typically put together, a computer screen and a keyboard computer screen and my coffee mug and refer to that as if it were another thing composed of those two things, right? We do think of the computer screen as one thing, but maybe it just reflects certain things about the way we process information, it seems like. All right, but we're different on the emergent individuals view, okay? This is important. So if this super intelligence that we imagine God creating were to leave us out when it counts up all the things here in this room, say, then he wouldn't be able fully to describe what is happening in and around my body or in your room, what's going on in and around your body. Our conscious, emergent capacities and their outworkings in our states of consciousness and our choices and so on make a fundamental difference to how things unfold, even at the subatomic level. There are fundamental causal relations between us and our own states of our brain and through them to the world that are over and above all the microphysical relationships on this view. So for that reason, a description or an inventory of what exists that leaves us out is going to be incomplete, because you can't even fully describe what's happening. You can't account for all the occurrences. You have to use a bit of language of philosophers, you have to quantify over us. That is, you have to treat us as an object, as a unity, right? In order to capture that, because we act as a unity. We perceive as a unity, okay? And so on. So in that sense, we are just as fundamental to the world as subatomic particles. Even though we are, unlike those subatomic particles, we are also composed of trillions of subatomic particles. Okay, so it's hard because we words like fundamental and basic are synonymous in English, but if we could arbitrarily say, call those things basic that have no parts, basic material objects that have no parts, well, then we're not basic, right? Only whatever turns out, whether it's subatomic particles that are currently known or something else, those things are basic. We're not. But we are fundamental if what we mean by that is we are sort of it's equally necessary to include us if you want to describe and therefore count up the things there are in the cosmos. In that sense of, anyway, that's how I think about it. So that means that when we undergo change, sometimes drastic change, right? I can lose a limb and so forth. There's always a fact of the matter as to whether I survive or am destroyed. Imagine I have a statue in front of you. I've got that Bob Dylan little picture there in the background. Okay. Yeah. And it's in a frame. It's got a little glass case. So I can take a hammer and start smashing it. And I can start cutting it with scissors, right? And the question is, you might say, when did that object cease to exist? At some point, if it's just down to a bunch of tiny little parts, you're going to say, it's gone, right? And if you owned it, you'd sue me. You say, so you destroyed my prized Bob Dylan picture, right? You owe me another one, right? But it can seem a little bit arbitrary to say just when it ceased to be, right? And that kind of shows that our category, in picture, whether it's a painting or an image like that, there's no fundamental objective fact of the matter. It's just, we tolerate, when we think about certain kinds of objects, a lot of change. A favorite blanket of a child, we'll say that's the same to the child. That's the same blanket, and it's just tatters, and everything. It's been holding that thing for months and drooling on it and all the rest, and it's just slowly getting frayed, right? But a work of art, right? You could do relatively superficial alterations of it, and the artist might say, you've destroyed my work of art, and sue you for major damages. So that seems kind of arbitrary. It seems to have to do with us, our conventions, our systems of value, what we value, and so on. Okay, right. Those are second-class objects, right? All these kind of things. We're first-class objects. It's always a fact of the matter. Subatomic particle, you could imagine saying, well, subatomic particles don't have parts, so you can't cut them in half, right? But God can annihilate a subatomic particle. And God could annihilate a subatomic particle and replace it at the very same instant with a distinct subatomic particle, so that no one, not the most super discerning scientist with the most sophisticated possible equipment, would notice a difference, right? Still, but there's a fact of the matter. Is it the same particle or not? It's a basic fact, really. It's just same particle. It's just, it is or it isn't, right? You can't give informative conditions about it, but it's objective, right? We all recognize the difference between saying, oh yeah, they're the particles following some trajectory through space or space and time, and God is continuously annihilating particles and replacing them so quickly you can see it. Those are totally different scenarios. Okay, so I sum up this view of human persons and our special kind of unity, the unity that guarantees there's always a fact of the matter about whether I survive, is saying that we are emergent individuals.
Just so I'm clear, when you say emergent individuals, that is not just synonymous with property dualism. Those are distinct ideas, right?
Yeah, well, I think of the emergent individual's view as a natural kind of consequence, you might say, of taking property dualism seriously leads you to embrace a view of individuals as emergent unities. I think, but yeah, but there have been people who've believed some version of property dualism that haven't thought about individuals having emergent properties, properties that are dual to their material properties. They haven't gone on to affirm that view. But I think
Okay.
it sort of follows, because I think once you embrace that there are properties of the whole, right? Well, then that means the whole has a certain kind of ontological fundamentality. It acts as a unity. It's because properties have consequences. Whatever properties you have, we're talking about natural causal powers, right? Whether they're powers of perception or simple conscious awareness or cognitive understanding or decision making, the ability to make choices that translate into actions. These are all psychological powers or capacities that we have. They're emergent capacities, in my view, and therefore they're capacities of the whole. And so it leads, I think, pretty straight away to this emergent individual's view.
To make sure I'm getting the picture right, I have a bunch of substances, fundamental or basic substances, as you're calling them. So, like the smallest, simplest thing, whatever that is. And I put a bunch of those together, and they have certain properties, these things. But when I put them together, this like bundle of things, from that bundle emerges this new property. Or not just new property, like singular, like it can be new properties, multiple, lots of things. Um, but it's that like unity that holds it all together. That's the individual. Am I getting that idea
Yeah,
right? So the
yeah,
thing that like
yeah,
unites it all together
right.
is the individual.
It's a suite of capacities that are, yeah, and these capacities they interlock, right? They kind of mesh together so that we function as coordinated wholes, very sophisticated coordinated wholes. We plan, we uh, all the things that make up human life. We function as highly integrated uh, individuals, right? But we're composed, right? And it's these high level capacities, these emergent capacities, that confer this kind of special unity on us, that kind of coordinate. So there's a kind of, there is bottom up causation in our bodies, of course, or subcellular parts together, enable the properties of cells, and cells functioning together enable the properties of organs, and so on. But we also, by virtue of having these sorts of properties, our bodies move through space and behave in ways that are largely determined by these top-down psychological states of ourselves. Yeah. And so in that sense, we move and function as unities.
Okay. So I wanted to get clear on what we mean by emergent individual, because now we're going to bring this back
Okay.
to that falling elevator model that we started with. There was an objection to it, and my kind of short summary of that objection is it just seems like something extrinsic to you just isn't what it takes to experience this kind of continuity. Whatever, if you experience this continuity, that's because of things intrinsic, not extrinsic to you. That's the basic gist of the objection in my mind. Is that a fair?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
now you tell this emergent individual story. connect it back. How does this get around that objection?
Good. Yeah. So remember, I was insisting that on the emergent individuals view, it follows that there's always a fact of the matter about whether I persist, right? You can't analyze my persistence entirely in terms of some kind of factors that admit of degrees. That might be a good way of actually expressing what do we mean by saying there's always a fact, fundamental fact of the matter. It can't be wholly determined by factors that admit of degrees, because then they're in some, degrees, you always have borderline cases. And in those borderline cases, there's just no fact of the matter. It's just those relations degrade to a certain degree, or they're only there to some degree. And that's all that's objectively true. Whether you want to call that same or not, it's up to you where you want to draw the line between red and orange or whatever. It's sort of like that. All right. So, but if there's always a fact of the matter, then what determines it? Now here, it's a little tricky. It's hard to say exactly. It's clear that there is a fact of the matter than to say what it is. That is, these capacities persist. So of course, every night we go to sleep, and sleep scientists tell us, you dream part of the night, but you don't dream all night, right? And so when you're in a non-dreaming phase of sleep, you're not consciously aware. At least, well, you can probably quarrel with that. Maybe you have very low grade. I don't know. Anyway, but let's assume that's right. So you're not. You're not in a persistently conscious state throughout your life, right? But you persistently have a capacity for conscious awareness, an emergent capacity, right? It may not be manifesting itself in any state of consciousness, but it's still present in your brain, right? It doesn't go away. And given that it's present in your brain, however that occurs, right, whatever the relationship is, it's having some kind of effect on you, right? All features of ourselves have some kind of effect on the states that we're in at any given moment. Similarly with our capacities for perception and cognitive understanding and decision-making, these kind of person-level attributes. So these capacities persist, and it's sort of in virtue of their persistence that I, together with this bodily material causal continuity, this life continuity, that I persist as the same individual. And so now the question is, okay, so then in the original falling elevator model scenario, we say, well, it's not hard to say, where do those capacities go? They don't go with the corpse. Corpse lacks, right? There are no emergent properties anymore, right? It now resolves into its material parts and nothing more, okay? But what about, could God cause my 10-year-old self to fission when I wasn't about to die? Then which would be 10-year-old Tim, and which would be the new fake Tim that was brought into existence, brand new individual brought into existence through this weird fission sort of scenario? Or do we say neither would be? That's, here it's going to depend on, how fission interacts with these capacities. And it's really, I get a bit of vertigo trying to determine how, because it feels like it ought to be an empirical question. It ought to be, as brain science evolves, we ought to be able to figure out, well, first thing to say, let's not talk about our brains, because our brains are not perfectly symmetrical, right? There's a lot of symmetry among the two hemispheres of our brain, but it's not perfectly symmetrical. So let's not chase that rabbit down that hole. We could play with the wrinkle of imagining it going, dividing into in a more readily understandable notion of fissioning. But all right, let's set that aside. So back to this original scenario. Which way would I go, or would I go neither? Well, you might say that's just kind of how God has set up ourselves, and how God, when he imbues this capacity, this natural but ordinarily undetectable capacity for cell fission, coordinated cell fissioning, right? That takes maybe a divine act to trigger that capacity, right? It, does the conscious self, that suite of emergent capacities, would they inevitably go one way rather than the other? Is there a kind of bias in the way the fissioning process is set up such that it would be so or not? I don't think the emergent individuals view has to, doesn't have to take a stand on this. He's just going to have to say there is a fact of the matter. And it could be, the fact of the matter could be neither. The way fissioning works, there's a rupture in the persistence of these capacities such that you got two new individuals. And so it all depends on how that fissioning capacity is inculcated, and how that process plays out. And so, but we can trust God if it's his intention to resurrect us, for us to survive death, then he's going to do it in such a way that we really do, right? And so in that case, there's no worry. What God might have done in a scenario we have no reason to think he intends to do, that is two living fission products, well, maybe he has a certain free hand. Maybe it's possible for him to set it up in different ways such that the outcomes are different, right? In some cases, you go with the spatially continuous body, if there is one. In other cases, you don't. In other cases, you don't survive. And it might be empirically undetectable, right? But there has to be a fact of the matter, because you are a unified individual. Just like, it would be, if you ask, you tell a physicist, well, how do you know God's not playing around and just constantly, continuously annihilating and replacing subatomic particles? The physicist is going to throw up his or her hands and say, I have no way of discriminating that scenario from one in which they persist. But that's not a reason to think there's not a fact of the matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, this may be a silly objection to that view. Does that still seem like something extrinsic? Like, well, I don't know. I'm thinking extrinsic in terms of God causing. But maybe it's like if God gives these, sets up like laws or something, and this thing's just kind of running, then now it doesn't seem extrinsic anymore. It seems just intrinsic, like the kind of thing I am just operates this way.
That's what I'm thinking. It's just weird because it's not a empirically detectable kind of law. It's not like a usual law of nature that in principle a scientist could hope to figure out, right? By doing the right kinds of experimentation and theory revision and all that. We could kind of zoom in on what that law looks like, whereas here we'd be at sea. But it would be internal, right? In the sense of it would have to do with what's happening to these powers as they fission. So there's a fact of the matter about these emergent level powers. And laws are just expressions of the powers of things, at least as I think of it. Right? Either you think that, or you don't think things, have intrinsic powers, and you think, no, God just sets up rules. That's what we call laws of nature, right? For how things move around. But if you go that way, then laws are kind of externally imposed by God, and so all persistence is external. So then, the objection the importance of the force of the objection diminishes, because it's all a matter of what God
decrees. It's not a matter of anything intrinsic, how things behave on this view, right? It's just a contingent set of patterns that God imposes on intrinsically inert matter. So, if you embrace that view of law, then plenty of, both non-religious and religious thinkers have that law, right? Only the religious thinkers think God institutes the laws, but they have a shared view about laws as these kinds of external pattern facts that somehow have an objective status, right? But they're not immanent to things. There are no such things as causal powers. That's just a way of talking. That's just a way of talking about the way the laws dictate the behavior of matter. If you go that route, this whole kind of line of worry kind of goes away, since whether or not something counts as being the same object is always going to be an extrinsic matter. It's going to always depend on these external laws. So the view is only, gets its force from a certain kind of way of thinking about causation and laws of nature. It's kind of what philosophers think of it as an Aristotelian view after Aristotle, causal, the immanent powers of things to do things. So, but even there, I want to say that's how I, for better or for worse, I do embrace that kind of picture, that Aristotelian picture of causation. And so I do face this kind of objection, but I want to say there can be a kind of immanent metaphysical fact of the matter, even though it's not an empirically measurable fact.
All right. Well, I wanted to keep this interview to roughly 1 hour, so I'm going to end it there. We had that there's this ending of your paper where you talk about some remaining theological issues, but I'm just going to tell the viewers, if you want to go check that out, I've put a link to the paper in the description of this video. You can click on it and read that section. It's actually pretty short. It's like maybe a page. It's not very long at all. So before we end the interview, I'd like you to wrap up, and I don't know if this is possible or not, but if you can do this in like 60 seconds, state this model of the resurrection. Like so if I said, Dr. O'Connor, how is the resurrection of the body possible? What do you say?
Okay, so the view assumes that we are embodied creatures, but we are a special kind of embodied creatures. We are holistic unities, right? By dint of our powers of consciousness and choice and intelligence and so on. But because we are embodied creatures, there needs to be, for us to survive the death, there needs to be some kind of causal material continuity between us now and us post in the afterlife, post death. So it seems like a way that God could bring this about is to enable the fundamental parts of our bodies to fission into two in a kind of coordinated fashion, such that one product is a corpse, which is no longer me, which is not me. It's merely the remainder, something I leave behind, and the other part is a continuing living thing that God occupies somewhere that we don't observe. And then at the general resurrection, when we all are resurrected simultaneously from the dead, we have new glorified bodies. This is a great, fascinating subject, but I don't have a lot of insight into that because the Apostle Paul doesn't give us much insight.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank you. All right. Well, I've really enjoyed this interview. Before we go, I'll mention for the viewer, I interviewed Dr. Trenton Merricks. He gave a physicalist model of the resurrection. In this one, you heard more of a property dualist / emergent individual account of the resurrection. And in another interview I'll be doing with Justin Mooney, he'll give the resurrection by reassembly model. So my hope is you can kind of hear these different accounts, these different models, see what counts in their favor, see what doesn't, and think about it for yourself. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you again, Dr. O'Connor.
All right, thank you.